A foul hush settled over Whitehall Palace in the early hours of a late winter morning. Torches flickered unevenly along the long corridor leading to the royal apartments, casting jittering shadows on cold stone walls. Somewhere beyond a heavy oak door lay a presence still and mute, yet charged with dread. Servants passing by spoke in hushed tones, fearful that their very whispers might disturb a queen who had reigned for nearly half a century. The air itself felt laden with unspoken terror, as though the palace had become conscious of its sovereign's peril. Behind that door, Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland Defender of the Faith, lay motionless upon a great canopy bed, draped in crimson velvet. Her once commanding frame immortalized for ages in portraits wearing gleaming ruffs and sumptuous gowns now seemed frail and shrunken. Each breath escaped in shallow, rasping gasps. A faint, sickly light filtered through the narrow window, illuminating the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the once regal glint in her gray eyes, now clouded by pain. The scent of lavender, meant to calm her, mingled with a sharper odor of sweat and fever. It was a cruel reminder that even the mightiest could be brought low by a creeping illness. No official word had emerged from the royal council. Rumors spread through the palace like wildfire, a sudden inexplicable fever, a mysterious swelling in her limbs, moments of delirium in which the queen spoke to shadows. Some whispered she had been poisoned by a rival faction. Others believed that years of relentless political burdens and betrayals had finally conspired with her advancing age to break her body. A silent question hovered. What would happen when the star of Elizabeth's Tudor line at last faded? Only days before, the court had celebrated her 45th anniversary on the throne, with feast speeches and lavish pageantry. Men and women had toasted to her wisdom her victory over the Spanish Armada, and her unwavering guidance through religious turmoil. Now the same corridors that once echoed with laughter and music felt empty and ungenerous. A stillness invaded every corner, an unspoken anticipation of something irrevocable. Courtiers ventured close to her chamber, though none dared to fully enter. A close attendant, Sir Thomas Egerton, lingered at the threshold, his face pale and lined. He recalled how the Queen months ago had dismissed the autumn chill without flinching. Now her hand lay cold upon the coverlet. In that moment, he wrestled with a hopeless question. Could Elizabeth's iron will withstand the cruel advance of mortality, or was this the prelude to an end no healer could avert? Beyond the walls of Whitehall, the capital pulsed with uneasy expectancy. London's streets, normally bustling with merchants and travelers, felt subdued. Market stalls saw fewer customers, and church bells tolled more solemnly. Commoners looked skyward as if seeking a sign, yet found only gray clouds scudding across a bleak horizon. The sanctity of faith that Elizabeth had fiercely protected seemed to quiver, as though even God held his breath in anxious reverence. Elizabeth herself remained half-conscious of the stirrings around her. Moments of lucidity flickered between waves of delirium. Once her eyes had opened wide and fixated on a dark tapestry depicting her defeat of Mary, Queen of Scots. In a trembling voice, she had whispered, "Was she worth it?" before her gaze blurred and sank back into fevered sleep. These fragments of thought, regret-guilt, fear haunted the corridors, whispered among the courtiers who believed they saw her ghostly reflection in every polished pane of glass. Yet amid the dread determination still flickered in her battered frame. Those close enough to witness her struggle spoke of a fire in her voice when she rasped out orders about the succession. The question of who would rule England after her consumed her last strength. Would the kingdom fracture without her steady hand? Would factional rivalries erupt into violence once she was gone? Even in her fading moments, Elizabeth's mind busied itself with politics that might outlast her mortal coil. Shadows lengthened as the day wore on, and the palace seemed to close in around her bedchamber. Servants shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the death knell would toll any hour. The queen's breathing grew more labored. Each exhalation sounded like a reluctant admission that fate approached. In that hushed corridor, the weight of centuries pressed down, for Elizabeth Stuart was not merely a queen, but a symbol, the very soul of an era. If her reign ended here, what would become of England's fragile peace? This was only the beginning of her final struggle. As her body weakened, forces both seen and unseen gathered to shape her destiny and that of an entire kingdom. The next moments would reveal how a monarch accustomed to commanding armies and negotiating treaties would confront the most formidable adversary of all, death. In the darkness beyond her chamber, the stage was set for a tragic finale, one whose echoes would reverberate through history. Elizabeth's breathing had grown even more ragged by the second week of March. Her once steady chest now rose and fell in shallow, hurried gasps, as though each inhalation required a tug-of-war between her will and her frail body. The cobblestones of Whitehall seemed to echo with the distant clatter of courtiers' shoes' footsteps that carried whispered rumors of her decline. Inside her chamber, the air felt perpetually thick-heavy, with the scent of overused linens, aromatic herbs, and unspoken dread. Every creak of the door, every hurried knock sent her pulse racing, even in her weakened state. Physically, Elizabeth's body was in revolt. Her legs had begun to swell grotesquely puffy, as though stuffed with water and tinged with a bruised purple that betrayed the onset of dropsy. When courtiers dared to peer beneath her silken skirts, they saw an emaciated form, bones jutting too sharply beneath thin, translucent skin. Her once radiant complexion had given way to a pallor so waxen it resembled old marble. In moments of feverish delirium, she kicked at the bedclothes as though striving to fight off unseen adversaries. On such nights, the chamber lords and ladies, forbidden from entering, but desperate to know her condition, listened at the door and heard labored moans. Some believed she was fanning the flames of imagination, others convinced that she was enduring agonies that no words could adequately capture. Physicians had flocked to her bedside. Dr. Thomas Monson, renowned for his steady hand and unflinching bedside manner, spent hours testing her pulse, pressing her abdomen, and probing for signs of improvement. He administered purges of laxatives and doses of theriac, a concoction brimming with opiates, herbs, and viper's flesh believed capable of expelling toxins. Leeches clung to her temples to draw off impure blood, while cups were pressed to her back in an attempt to suction away ill humors. Each treatment seemed to trade one agony for another. Pulling leeches stung her temples like mocking fingers clawing at her skull. Purges left her too weak to lift her head. She coughed frequently, hacking up phlegm tinged with rust-colored rust, raising fears of a chest infection complicating her already grave condition. In rarer moments when she sat propped upon cushions, her eyes glassy but still regal, would track the movements of her attendants as though appraising them, measuring their loyalty, even from this brink. Yet more agonizing than the physical tortures were the encroachments of politics and paranoia. Word had leaked that some courtiers whispered she might not live to see Easter. Factional rivalries, once held in check by her commanding presence, now roiled like a storm beneath a fragile calm. Robert Cecil, her trusted Secretary of State, worked tirelessly to consolidate power behind the scenes. Cecil bore a reputation for steely calculation. In Elizabeth's ear whispers, he was both confidant and enforcer. But as her strength ebbed, so did her capacity to rein in his ambition. Across the palace yard, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, once favored and now marginalized, paced in desperation. Essex recalled how he had once dazzled Elizabeth with martial valor in Ireland. Now he felt betrayed, convinced that Cecil plotted his downfall. Essex's imperious temper cast a shadow over every council meeting where he sparred with Cecil, and threatened though no one dared repeat his words. exactly that England might slip into chaos without a clear heir. The question of succession haunted every whisper. Elizabeth had never married. The Virgin Queen had nurtured an image of fidelity to her people rather than a mortal spouse. Yet in these dire days, the kingdom demanded an heir. Across the border in Scotland, James VI, her nearest relative, positioned himself carefully. James's ambassadors circulated through London's taverns and noble houses, currying favor among those who might shape the future monarchy. Coins bearing James's visage were rumored to exchange hands in secret, as if anticipating the Queen's demise. Some suggested that Cecil himself favored an arrangement where James would marry a Protestant English lady, perhaps a Maltravers or a Howard, to cement alliances. Others whispered that Essex, chafing under Cecil's designs, contemplated a marriage between James and one of his own kin to weaken Cecil's advantage. Amid this high-stakes game, Elizabeth's mind teetered between lucidity and clouded confusion. When coherent, she scrawled notes on scraps of parchment directives for Cecil, admonitions to Essex, even instructions to her ladies-in-waiting about preserving her chambers. On one particularly lucid morning, she summoned Sir John Harington to her bedside. Harington, her godson and jester-in-chief, offered a jest about the fragrance of her chamber, claiming it smelled like a summer's garden trapped in winter's grasp. Elizabeth managed a faint smile, but her eyes flickered with icy determination. She warned him, "Let no fool fancy that if I fall, England rises unscathed." As Harington bowed, tears glistened in his eyes. He would later recall haunting images of her dragging herself upright to sign more papers, a skeletal figure wielding quill as if it were a weapon against fate. Those few coherent moments only intensified the court's anguish. Gentlemen jockeyed for access novices in the art of obedience, cloaked as loyal subjects. Some brought elusive rumors of improvements, a slight dip in fever, a color returning briefly to her cheeks, only to dash hopes when the Queen lapsed into renewed delirium. At bedchamber doors, maids and pages lingered, subsisting on stolen glances and furtive tears. An older half-brother once rebuked her. "Why did you deny us a spouse-sister? Now you leave this realm to hungry wolves." But Elizabeth, even in feebleness, had dismissed notions of maternity as distractions from her higher purpose. She had once said in court with piercing conviction, "I have but one mistress here, and her name is all England." Now, though her body betrayed her, that fiery devotion to her realm burned until her final breaths. As the days passed, the sickness took on new dimensions. Her ankles swelled further until she required cushions under both legs to alleviate the weight, and she could no longer walk even a few steps. When guards carried her in a sedan chair to witness council meetings, her narrow corset seemed to constrict her diaphragm, intensifying her wheezing. One afternoon, Elizabeth fainted halfway down the corridor, and attendants caught her before she struck the polished floors. The sight of her unconscious frame, draped in velvet and lace, sent shivers through those assembled. Many gripped one another's arms in panic if the Queen could faint. What else could endanger her existence? Superstitions, too, rose to the surface. Some common folk gathered outside the palace gates at night, offering whispered prayers for the Queen's recovery. Others, fearful of divine retribution, claimed her prolonged reign had provoked God's wrath. Sermons in St. Paul's Cathedral preached repentance for heresy and moral excesses at court. Yet Elizabeth, always a master of religious politics, had navigated between Catholics and Protestants with pragmatic skill. Now the devotion of Protestant preachers bolstered the belief that her sickness was a test of faith, not divine condemnation. In clandestine gatherings, Catholic priests offered masses for her soul, hoping a living saint might bring unity between confessions. Elizabeth, well aware of these factions, would have quietly despised any attempt to exploit her illness for religious gain. Underneath these swirling currents of medicine, faith, and ambition, Elizabeth's own spirit endured a profound transformation. Friends and foes alike were struck by how often she whispered of her mortality, not with fear, but reflective resignation. In one rare lucid moment, she summoned Sir Walter Raleigh, her former beloved and prisoner in the Tower. Raleigh knelt beside her bed, his gaunt face lined by years of imprisonment. She asked, "Do you think my soul shall find rest?" Raleigh hesitated, grappling for words beneath the weight of such severity. He spoke of God's mercy and a legacy unsurpassed. Elizabeth's rasped reply cut through the chamber like a dagger. "I have served this realm truthfully. If my name endures, it is by their remembrance, not their fear." That bitter acceptance laid bare her fearlessness. She confronted death as she had every adversary, head-on, unwavering. Yet everyone who witnessed the exchange felt the air crackle with the truth that despite her regal facade, she yearned for absolution as much as recognition. Still, as her condition worsened, some factions grew bolder. Cecil convened secret councils in his London townhouse, drafting proclamations to ensure a smooth transition to James VI. Essex, in contrast, conferred with discontented nobles in distant estates, plotting an entreaty of armies that might force Cecil's hand. The Queen's bedchamber had become a microcosm of England's fragilities, a dying monarch's final breaths dictating the fate of dynasties. Courtiers scribbled petitions, forged alliances, or quietly sold their allegiance to whichever side promised them greater influence. In this atmosphere, even the humblest footman felt the tension at his back. If Elizabeth did not recover, bombs of conspiracy might explode within weeks. Amid these external tremors, Elizabeth's psychological anguish was unmistakable. Sleep eluded her more nights than not. When she did sleep, nightmares tormented her. She murmured about anchors dragging in stormy seas, about shadows flitting at the corners of her vision. Her cat, an aging black Tom named Ratcliffe, became her only constant companion. She stroked him in moments of clarity, confiding secrets she dared not voice, allowed worries for her people, regrets over lost opportunities, fear that her legacy might unravel into civil strife. Ratcliffe, usually skittish, would nuzzle her wrist as though offering solace, but that too was tinged with tragedy. No creature could truly heal a nation's suffering or a queen's faltering heart. As March waned, the courtiers observed that Elizabeth's appearance had become spectral. When messages arrived from the Scottish court, assurances of James's loyalty, condolences from his mother Mary of Lorraine, they were brought in hushed voices and presented with furtive deference. Elizabeth read these dispatches, her trembling fingers tracing each line. Once she halted, looked up at Cecil, and said softly, "Am I imprisoning them by clinging so long? Would Scotland be free to breathe if I abdicated to death?" Cecil bowed, tears in his eyes, but gave no answer. He understood that her passing would be England's rebirth, but at what cost? And so, in these darkest days, Elizabeth's body lay besieged by illness, her mind assailed by memories and doubts, and her realm caught in a web of intrigue that tightened with each gasp she drew. The cause of her physical deterioration, whether a lingering fever, congestive cardiac failure, or the ravages of age, remained unclear even to her most trusted physicians. Yet the true cause of her growing despair lay in her awareness of power's fragility, that a reign built on iron resolve and political acumen could crumble in a matter of breathless hours. Each cough, each whisper of pain, became a reminder that even a monarch could stand powerless before the inexorable march of fate. As dawn broke on the final week of her life, Elizabeth's chamber was awash in a pale, dim light. Beyond the window, embers of saffron and rose tinted the sky, as though heralding both an ending and an unknowing beginning. Inside the Queen's face was a mask of both stoic acceptance and searing anguish. Her attendants watched from a respectful distance as she summoned the last reserves of her strength to speak. In that moment, the hidden currents of politics, medicine, and faith converged. It was as if her entire life, all the battles she had fought against Spain, against religious schism, even against her own fears, culminated in a single exhale. The question now was not who would succeed her, but whether her realm could emerge from this storm with unity intact. In the hush that followed her strained words, a tension lingered so heavy that those present felt it press upon their ribs. Elizabeth, though frail, had planted a seed of defiance. No matter her fate, she refused to depart quietly. Her final days would not simply be a descent into oblivion, but a testament to a reign that had shaped England's destiny. Behind her lay a lifetime of triumphs and betrayals. Before her lay the uncertain future of a kingdom on the brink. And in that moment, as her pale fingers trembled over her prayer book, one truth became unmistakably clear. Elizabeth's final struggle against sickness, against conspiracies, against the very inevitability of death, would define the closing act of a life as formidable as any she had led. By the first dawn of her final week, Elizabeth's chamber seemed suffused with a ghostly half-light. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches as if nature itself lamented the Queen's suffering. Within the curtained alcove, Elizabeth's breaths fell in harsh, rasping intervals, each one a hammered stroke in a symphony of decay. Her body, once the cornerstone of Tudor majesty, trembled under the weight of relentless fever and dropsical swelling. Yet even as her strength tapered, she summoned what fierce reserves remained, mindful that the storm of politics and ambition swirled beyond her weakened frame. No sooner had the council convened that morning than tensions erupted like pent-up lightning. The great hall, lined with tapestries depicting ancestors' triumphs, now seemed a theater of dueling loyalties. Robert Cecil, clad in sober black, held a sealed missive from James VI of Scotland. His refined posture barely masked a tethered eagerness, eyes-sharp voice controlled yet poised to strike. Opposite him, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, stood with arms folded, cheeks aflame. Essex's once proud countenance, now ashen yet defiant, betrayed indignation at being marginalized. His soft clenched fists hinted at rage barely contained behind the veneer of courtly restraint. "Her Majesty's health is precarious," Cecil intoned, voice low but resolute, "and we must ensure stability. I propose that we prepare an open proclamation to announce Prince James as successor, pending Her Grace's assent." Murmurs rippled through assembled nobles. Some inclined toward Cecil's plan, convinced that a swift public declaration might deter factional violence. Others recoiled at the thought of bypassing Elizabeth's final wishes, fearing it would sully her reputation and risk civil unrest. Essex strode forward, cloak trailing like a storm cloud. "You would leap upon her death," Cecil, he spat, voice echoing off stone walls. "You forget that we serve the late Queen, not a foreign prince. If Her Majesty breathes, yet we claim her voice above all." Behind Essex, a handful of young lords nodded in solidarity, their features taut with anxiety. The hall's tension crackled as though thunder lurked in overhead rafters. A hush descended when Sir Thomas Egerton entered, physical pain etched on his face. As Lord Chancellor, he bore news that both quelled and fanned the flames. Elizabeth's fever had surged overnight. Dr. Monzon warned that she might not awaken at dawn. Egerton's deference to both Cecil and Essex underscored the fragile balance of power. He studied their faces, calculating which path promised greater stability, or at least a lesser cataclysm. Essex's voice cut through the silence, harsh and determined. "Then let us seek the Queen's will before folly grips our realm. I demand to know her true desire." He fixed his gaze on Cecil, who offered no immediate retort. Instead, Cecil inclined his head toward Egerton. "If Her Majesty has strength to speak, we must honor her words." The assembled council agreed that a messenger be dispatched to Elizabeth's bedchamber, where any testament she uttered would supersede speculation. The corridors beyond the council chamber felt oppressively narrow, as Egerton hurried the urn-bearing page toward the Queen's suite. Flickering torches cast quivering patterns on walls, making every archway seem to breathe. Within, Elizabeth lay propped by a mound of pillows, each one soaked through with perspiration. Dr. Monson and a handful of midwives tended her, the air pungent with vinegar-soaked cloths placed upon her forehead. As the page entered, clutching the locketed note from the council, Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered in fragile awareness. Her breathing hitching, she reached for a silver chalice of iced rosewater, each sip a visible effort, while her attendants knelt at a respectful distance. Egerton bent low, presenting the folded parchment. "Your Majesty," he whispered, voice thick with urgency, "the council awaits your command. They ask for your will on the matter of succession." Elizabeth's glazed eyes fixated on the seal, her trembling hand brushing away stray strands of gray-black hair from a sunken cheekbone. She studied the room as though gathering final impressions of her loyal servants. A wave of fever washed over her, causing her to close her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them once more, they held a clarity that pierced the room's anxious hush. "I have no wish to invite strife upon my people," she rasped, each syllable labored as if she tugged them from the depths of her soul. "England shall not fracture under my passing." Her gaze shifted to Cecil. "Let James of Scotland be proclaimed. Yet swear to me that you will preserve our Protestant faith, shield it from papist hands." Cecil's lips quivered as he bowed. "As your Majesty wills," he breathed, retrieving his quill to ink her words for the council's record. Essex, arms crossed, watched in silent fury, his jaw clenched so tightly, the vein in his temple throbbed like a drumbeat. Though he would not defy her final pronouncement, he cursed himself for granting Cecile the opportunity to cement power unchallenged. As word spread that Elizabeth had spoken, a murmur of both relief and dread coursed through the noble houses of London. Yet the crisis was far from averted. Complicated questions remained. Should the proclamation wait until after her passing, or be issued at once to deter plots? Did Essex truly relent, or would he foment rebellion to advance an alternative plan? The volatility of answers to such questions grew more potent than any contagion. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's physical torment intensified. Dr. Monson, pale and exhausted, pressed a cloth soaked in bitter herbal decoction to her lips. Each swallow of the foul medicine caused her to gag her back, arching in agony. The room seemed to shrink as her breathing strangled, bearing the fragility of her once indomitable frame. She clutched the side of the canopy bedrail, knuckles white, as though willing herself not to slip into unconsciousness. A single cough, wet and rattling, echoed like a death knell, reminding all present that her body was a battlefield where dark forces held sway. At her bedside, Sir John Harington laid out a small leather-bound prayer book. "Your Majesty," he said, voice trembling, "the hour may be near." "Shall I read Psalm 90, as you commanded?" Elizabeth's head lolled, and she nodded weakly. Harington began to recite in solemn cadence. The words, "Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations," floated through the chamber, mingling with the crackle of torch flames and the fainting echoes of raven calls outside. As he reached the lines about endurance and hope, Elizabeth's lips moved, whispering every verse, though her voice wavered like a dying candle in a storm. At that moment, the hall's political thunderclaps collided with her confinement. Essex's faction, deprived of direct influence, met in secret chambers beneath Lambeth Palace. There the Earl and his co-conspirators, flushed with anticipation, plotted a swift seizure of the Tower of London to claim the regalia before Cecil's allies could move. They whispered of securing support among disaffected militias in the home counties, banking on chaos to force Cecil's hand. From a hidden slit in their meeting room, Essex gazed out at the Thames, its dark waters reflecting the crimson light of a dwindling sun. He clenched his fist, vowing that if Cecil would not share power willingly, He would seize it by force, even if it cost English blood. Back in Whitehall, a sudden commotion shattered the chamber's somber rhythm. A page burst through the door, eyes wide in alarm. "Your Majesty," he panted. The Earl of Essex leads armed men toward the river gate. Panic rippled among attendants. Eyewitnesses claimed Essex's contingent bearing midnight blue banners had marched through West Smithfield, urging peasantry and emboldened mercenaries to join, declaring that they fought for the true cause of England, not a Scottish interloper. For a moment, Elizabeth opened her eyes, unblinking, as though sensing the tumult beyond walls. She winced, brow furrowing in pain, yet her first words pierced the chaos, "Bind us to prayer, not to warfare." Even bedridden, her command cut through discord like a sharpened sword. Courtiers scrambled to calm skittish soldiers stationed in the yard. Tawny-haired Captain Howard, sword at side, raised his voice to arms. Protect the Queen, not the rabble's revolt. In the dim hallway, clashing boots and drawn blades signaled the conflict's outbreak. Essex's men clattered along the marble floors, intent on forcing their way in. A thunderous knock rang on Elizabeth's chamber door, fist pounding like angry hail. Sir Thomas Egerton sprang forward, locking the chamber latch. "They shall not enter," he declared, voice trembling with righteous fury. Yet even as he couldn't be sure of holding the door, Cecil burst into the room, cloak swirling, paper in hand. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "we must sign the letters patent now. I alone cannot stop Essex if he breaches the gate." Elizabeth summoned the last flicker of her resolve. With trembling fingers, she signed the document commissioning James VI as rightful heir to her crowns. Her quill scratched across folded parchment, each word baited with her final authority. "Here lies England's future," she murmured, tears sliding down hollow cheeks. In that moment, her frail form seemed to swell with majestic power, as though the regnant blood in her veins pulsed with one final beat of sovereignty. The finished letters, sealed by her trembling wax, impressed a fate no rebellion could override. Even as she dismissed exhaustion, attendants wrapped her in silken shawls, aware that triumph was bittersweet. She had staved off Essex's insurrection, at least for now. But the toll on her body was catastrophic. She lay back as Cecil strode away, clutching the document to his breast, as if it were a talisman warding off upheaval. Outside, Essex's men momentarily faltered their momentum, breaking against the iron will of loyal guards. But the rumble of defiance still coursed through the city, like an infection, its full damage yet to be revealed. Inside the chamber, Elizabeth's mind wavered on the cusp of oblivion. Flashes of her life passed before her, the rallying cries against the Armada, the hushed councils convened in candle-lit rooms, her solitary walks in Richmond Gardens, pondering the weight of her crown. Now, even as the letters patent lay signed, sealing her will, a profound sorrow seized her chest. She understood that every victory demanded a price far greater than the fleeting triumph. The kingdom might endure, but at the cost of her own obliteration. A final rattle in her throat signaled the approach of oblivion. Dr. Monzon pressed a chilled cloth to her forehead, voice gentle. "Your Majesty, rest now." As her eyelids fluttered closed, she murmured only 3 words, as though casting a benediction over a realm she had governed with shrewd cunning and unyielding courage. England must live. In that breath, the climax of her reign intertwined inextricably with the ravaging demise of her body. Forces of loyalty and treason, hope and despair converged in this singular moment. The frail queen, poised between life and death, had struck the decisive blow in her final battle, a battle to safeguard her legacy from the shadows that threatened to engulf it. Her consent, inked by quivering hand, formed the turning point that would shape an empire's destiny. Yet tensions remained unresolved. Essex's embers of rebellion still smoldered, and the council's unity hung by a thread. Beyond the chamber's threshold, guards tightened ranks. Courtiers whispered fervent prayers. The question lingered in every heart. Present, could a kingdom survive the passing of its indomitable sovereign without succumbing to bloodshed? And most poignantly, could Elizabeth's spirit find rest, knowing she had risked everything to shield England from the tempest? In the hush that followed her last words, the chamber seemed to tremble with an echo of finality. The Queen's twilight struggle had reached its zenith, yet even as her body sank into unconsciousness, the war for England's soul raged on, poised to erupt the moment life slipped from her grasp. And so, in that charged stillness, the world awaited the final reckoning, for the true climax of Elizabeth's reign was sealed not in triumphs of conquest, but in the crucible of her deathbed's convulsions, where power and mortality clashed in a spectacle both tragic and transcendent. A stillness heavier than midnight fell over Elizabeth's chamber, as both candle and dawn light waned into a weak gray haze. The tremors of her breath had subsided to near silence, and the faint hiss of the drip of medicinal syrups became the only rhythm in the room. Outside, the distant tolling of St. Paul's bells marked the hour with somber insistence, but within these curtains, time felt suspended, each second stretched taut like the final strand of a fraying tapestry. Elizabeth lay motionless upon the bed, her once handsome features now gaunt and hollowed by days of fever and pain. Her eyes half-lidded, flickered with a last glimmer of awareness as Dr. Monzon knelt beside her cool cloth, pressed to her forehead. He watched the pulse in her temple waver once strong, now a faint flutter that threatened to disappear entirely. Midwives hovered at the edges of the chamber, their faces pale beneath their coifs, recalling in hushed tones the urgency of her condition. Every few moments her chest rose in a final desperate gasp that echoed like the last inhale of a silver bell. At her side, Sir John Harington held her trembling hand. His lips parted as though to speak comfort, yet no words seemed fit to articulate the gravity of this moment. He recalled how in better days her laugh had filled these halls with bright rolling warmth. Now her lips barely moved, and the laughter of old sounded like a distant memory. He whispered a prayer, his voice cracking, but Elizabeth's eyes only tracked the flicker of the torchlight. In that azure gaze, he saw not fear, but a solemn resignation, as though she had already negotiated with destiny and was ready to accept its final decree. Beyond the chamber door, Sir Thomas Egerton and Robert Cecil paced in muffled anxiety. The news had spread swiftly. Elizabeth's strength was failing. They exchanged glances heavy with dread, knowing that the moment of her passing would shape England's fate. It was Cecil who finally broke the silence. "Prepare for the end," he uttered in a hushed tone, voice low as grave dirt. "Signal to the council that Her Majesty shall be declared deceased within the hour. We must preserve order before chaos consumes us." At that command, chapel, bells across Whitehall tolled in mournful chords. The sound rippled through corridors and balconies, drawing courtiers from their hiding places as though lured by a tolling funeral knell. In the bedchamber, Elizabeth's breathing slowed until a long pause stretched between her last shallow exhalation and the moment she finally let go. With a final quiver at the corners of her lips, she murmured something under her breath, indiscernible perhaps a prayer or a plea for mercy, and then her body went limp. Her eyes closed, and an unbroken silence followed, filled only by the faint rustle of silk and the suppressed sobs of those present. Dr. Monzon placed a slender hand on her cold wrist and pronounced the words that no one had wished to speak. "Her Majesty, the Queen, lies dead." A gasp rippled through the small assembly. Harrington bowed his head, tears spilling unrestrained as he kissed her fingers. At that same moment, Cecil turned pale as ash realization and grief mingling in his eyes. Beside him, Egerton dropped to one knee before the bed forehead, nearly touching the crimson quilt in a gesture of profound reverence. The midwives wept softly, their white caps bobbing in the lamplight. News of her death spread through Whitehall like wildfire. In the vast courtyard, sentries lowered their halberds and stood at rigid attention shutters on windows were closed, and guards saluted the empty direction of the bedchamber. In the antechamber, ladies-in-waiting collapsed into each other's arms. A hush fell upon the palace, so unlike the clamor of courtly life that daily bustle felt like a distant dream. Farther away in London, the city's air grew thick with both grief and apprehension. Makers and merchants paused their trades when the solemn proclamation sounded from the Tower of London: Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, is no more. Street criers announced the news in marketplaces, and commoners wept openly, recalling how her visage had guided them through years of plague war and uncertainty. Somber hymns drifted from parish churches as parishioners knelt in prayer, their voices uniting in lamentation. In Whitehall's council chamber, Cecil convened an emergency session. His face was a mask of calm, but each line betrayed the tension twisting within. As regent-designate, he read aloud the Queen's final instructions: maintain the Protestant Church, secure the peace, and proclaim James Stuart as rightful successor. Those words hung in the air, like a solemn covenant. Egerton, rising to his feet, formally sealed Elizabeth's last will and testament his quill, trembling only slightly as he affirmed her directives. Yet not all hearts bent to Cecil's careful order. In a hidden corner of the palace, Earl of Essex paced with 3 loyal companions drawn by the tolling bells and fueled by the hope that the Queen's death might still yield opportunity. They glanced over clenched maps and hastily scrawled messages to militia leaders eager to seize the Tower and claim the regalia before loyalty could be marshaled in James's favor. But as word arrived that Cecil already held the Great Seal of England, Essex's pride faltered. He drew a sword from a scabbard in pale leather, but his hand shook as he raised it. A signal from the gate loyal guards bearing James's banner warned him that any attempt to contest the succession would be met with force. Swallowing his rage, he sheathed the blade. For a fleeting moment his defiance simmered, and then he slipped into the shadowed corridors, plotting his retreat. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's coffin had been prepared, an austere wooden bier laid upon ornate rollers of polished oak. Her body lay dressed in funeral robes of black velvet, edged with gold hands, folded over a gilded prayer book. A crown of a simpler iron circlet rested upon her brow, signifying both her sovereignty and her final surrender to mortality. Harrington and Egerton gently lowered the coffin, and attendants draped it in the royal banner, the rose of Tudor entwined with the lion rampant of England. In that silent act, Elizabeth's reign was consecrated in death, a flame extinguished, but a light that would endure in memory. A funeral procession formed outside the palace gates, rows of mourning knights in black tabards. Military trumpets stuttered a dirge, and clergy in sable surplices intoned prayers for the Queen's soul. The carriage bearing her coffin rolled slowly toward Westminster Abbey, flanked by mounted guards, whose horses struck sparks from the cobblestones with each step. Crowds lined the route, tears streaming down faces from all stations, commoner merchant noble alike, united in the recognition of what had been lost and uncertain of what was to come. Within the abbey's stone walls, the service commenced. As the dean intoned psalms, a hush more profound than any earthly silence settled over the nave. The scent of incense curled in the dim air, and shafts of soft morning light fell upon the carved tombs of England's ancestors. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt, the echo of the clods of earth returning to the grave resounded like a final heartbeat. In that moment, Elizabeth Tudor, whose image had once radiated defiance in stained-glass windows and broadsheets, was laid to rest among kings and warriors. The vaulted ceilings captured a collective intake of breath, both grief and awe, leaving an unspoken question to hang in the chill air. Could England truly endure without her guiding hand? As mourners filed out into a pale afternoon, their steps mechanized by ritual, the throng outside parted like a solemn sea to let the funeral carriage pass. Lord Cecil remained near the tomb robes, trailing in a pool of shadow, tracing the last syllables of a prayer upon folded parchment. He knew that every soul within those abbey walls had borne witness to the Queen's legacy, yet none could deny that her death had cracked open the very foundations of the realm. Outside courtiers gathered in hushed conclave, measuring alliances anew, whispering of James's impending arrival. The social fabric felt frayed. Loyalty held together by Elizabeth's presence would now be tested by the precarious dawn of a new reign. That night in Whitehall, Harrington set down a single candle by the empty bed where Elizabeth had drawn her final breath. The chamber, once so full of life and command, felt vast and lonely. Every piece of furniture, her velvet-covered chair, her carved oak desk, stood as a silent witness to her passing. In the corner, Ratcliffe the cat, curled into a ball, his head resting on the Queen's discarded cuff, as though mourning the one who once stroked his fur and whispered solace into his feline ears. And so the tragic curtain fell on Elizabeth I. In death, she achieved a peace that had eluded her in life, a release from the burdens of power and the torments of choice. Yet the vacuum her passing created allowed ancient rivalries and new ambitions to stir, as though England had awakened from a half-century's reverie, only to stare at an uncertain horizon. The solemn echo of her death would reverberate through the court across the city and beyond the sea-kissed shores of her empire. In those dark days, the weight of her absence epitomized both the fragility of mortal rule and the enduring power of a sovereign's memory. In the hush that followed, one truth prevailed. Elizabeth's final act, the silent relinquishing of her crown, marked not only the end of an era, but the painful beginning of another. In the weeks that followed Elizabeth's passing, England felt as though it teetered on the edge of an abyss. The carefully woven tapestry of politics and religion she had maintained began to unravel in subtle yet profound ways. Though James VI of Scotland, soon to be James I of England, assumed the throne with relative calm, the repercussions of Elizabeth's reign and death rippled across court and country. Her consecrated directives proclaimed from the deathbed had forestalled immediate civil conflict. Yet beneath that fragile peace, her legacy set into motion currents that would reshape the realm for generations to come. First, Elizabeth's insistence on preserving the Protestant Church reverberated in every corner of the kingdom. James, raised in a complex tapestry of Calvinist and Presbyterian influences, honored her wish, at least initially, by reaffirming the Church of England's primacy. However, his Scots-born advisors pressed for greater tolerance toward Puritan reformers, a trend that would soon stir undercurrents of dissent. The question of religious uniformity, which Elizabeth had navigated with cautious pragmatism, became an enduring fault line under James's rule. Factional debates over liturgy governance and episcopal authority seeds, sown in Elizabeth's final command, would later bloom into the more volatile conflicts of Charles I's reign and ultimately civil war. Economically, Elizabeth's prudent stewardship had left the treasury burdened but intact. She had avoided large-scale continental wars, relying instead on privateering and strategic alliances. James inherited both her coffers and her debts. Early glimmers of prosperity in trade and exploration, championed by merchants who had flourished under Elizabeth's protective policies, continued in the Jacobean era. Yet James's lavish spending and favor toward Scottish courtiers strained the balance. In the aftermath of Elizabeth's disciplined expenditure, England confronted a paradox. Her frugality revealed how quickly royal largesse could undo decades of fiscal caution. Culturally, Elizabeth's reign had lit a renaissance of letters, drama, and exploration. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser, patronized by her court, flourished. Elizabeth's death marked the symbolic close of that golden age. Under James, playwrights turned their pens toward more overtly political and doctrinal themes, reflecting the shifting currents of a new monarch's priorities. The theaters where audiences had once reveled in the triumph of the Virgin Queen's spirit now staged tragedies that echoed the fragility of power and impermanence of any ruler, echoes of Elizabeth's final struggle manifesting in verse and stagecraft. Perhaps most poignantly, Elizabeth's legacy endured in the hearts and minds of her subjects as the embodiment of a sovereign who had wielded authority with a combination of resolve and restraint. Commoners spoke of her as Good Queen Bess, recalling how she had balanced fearsome punishment with genuine compassion for her people. Her image, crowned, poised, resolute, became the emblem of English identity, a nation united under a Protestant independent crown. Yet, in remembering her as infallible, few acknowledged the brittle tensions she had masked. Her dramatic deathbed pronouncement had bought a fleeting interval of stability. It had also concealed the deeper fractures that would later erupt. On a personal level, those closest to Elizabeth grappled with grief and guilt. Robert Cecil, though outwardly composed, spent long nights poring over her correspondence and final instructions, convinced he must perfect her vision of peace. Sir Thomas Egerton withdrew into a contemplative solitude, haunted by images of her resilient gaze, and haunted by the knowledge that he had witnessed the final moments of a queen who had shaped his entire life. Sir John Harrington, bereft of his godmother's counsel, turned to writing memoirs, hoping to preserve her words and character for posterity. Each retelling of Elizabeth's life emphasized her statesmanship, yet those who had stood beside her knew that her true power lay in her willingness to weave tragedies into triumphs and to rule with empathy, even as she bore the weight of so many burdens. Elizabeth's tragic finale also offered a cautionary lesson about power's inherent precariousness. She had reigned for 45 years by skillfully balancing competing factions, yet in the end, no mortal stratagem could forestall the prospect of death. Her body's collapse bore witness to the fact that all political fortresses crumble before time. For successive monarchs, her example loomed as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that even the most celebrated ruler must temper ambition with wisdom and foresight. In this light, scholars and statesmen of later generations studied her life as a manual in political navigation, emulating her deft diplomacy, absorbing her missteps, and contemplating the limitations she had encountered in her final days. Beyond England's shores, Elizabeth's passing marked the culmination of an era in European dynastic politics. Her careful maneuvering had positioned England as a formidable Protestant power, altering the balance on the continent. Under James, the great game of alliances and conflicts shifted toward attempts at détente with Catholic Spain and an ill-fated quest for a unified British Isles. Yet precisely because Elizabeth had forged England's identity as uniquely independent attempts to replicate her equilibrium often faltered. Her death summoned a new generation of rulers and diplomats to grapple with the consequences of her long and storied reign. And so when historians look back, they see Elizabeth's final days not simply as the collapse of a queen's health, but as the decisive pivot upon which a nation turned. The legacy of her deathbed command, "England must live," became an enduring creed. It reminded the realm that monarchy itself was but a stewardship granted by Providence to be wielded with humility and courage. Even in the face of a world fraught with religious zealotry, political ambition, and human frailty, Elizabeth had maintained a vision of unity. Today, her image remains etched in stone and ink, from the statues that guard palace gates to the pages of history books that chronicle her triumphs and tragedies. The lessons of her final struggle of maintaining dignity in decline, of wielding power without arrogance, and of balancing principle with pragmatism continue to resonate. In a modern context, when leaders face crises of health conscience or geopolitics, they look to Elizabeth's example, to the stoic grace with which she confronted her mortality and the resolute compassion that guided her final decisions. In contemplating her life and death, we are reminded that history does not end when a ruler's crown is laid to rest. Rather, each conclusion begets a legacy that reshapes society's trajectory. Elizabeth's grave at Westminster Abbey might hold her mortal form, but her spirit, embodied in the enduring identity of a nation, lives on. Her final legacy, born in the silence of that chamber, where she breathed her last, stands as both a triumph of human resolve and a solemn caution that power's truest worth lies not in domination, but in service to one's people, even in the face of the darkest hour.